Hello, my name is Oscar. I study at the Pan American University of Puerto in the Faculty of Education and Humanities School of Modern Languages. In today's video, I'm going to provide a very brief explanation about relative clauses. First, let's look at the definition for clauses or relative clause before diving deeper into the different types of clauses that we can find in English. So, first, a relative clause is a type of dependent clause that functions as an adjective because it modifies or provides more information about a noun or pronoun in a sentence. So, looking at this, looking at some examples is going to help to be very useful in understanding this definition. But the main takeaway that we can learn from this is that the relative clauses function as an adjective. So they characterize or provide additional information about a noun or a pronoun. In other words, a subject. So let's begin to look at some types of relative clauses. And there is one main categorization that we must study, which is defining relative clauses and non defining relative clauses. So, the criteria to differentiate these two types of relative clauses is, as the word suggests, defining or non defining, is that the first one, defining relative clauses, is essential. It is needed to identify the noun of the sentence, and it's necessary for the whole sentence to keep its meaning. So if we were to delete the defining relative clause from a sentence, the meaning would change. So the structure of a defining relative clause in a sentence, we would have first the noun, the subject, then a relative pronoun, and then the verb. Some characteristics for defining relative clauses are, as I mentioned, that they are essential to identifying the subject or the noun for the sentence of the sentence, and but also they don't use commas because non-defining relative clauses are characterized by being between commas. So defining don't use commas. Some keywords that we can possibly find in defining relative clauses: who, whom, whose, which, and that. But let's look at an example to understand this better. So for a defining relative clause, we have the following sentence: the man who is speaking is my brother. The man who is speaking is my brother. So we can see the structure that I had just mentioned. First, the noun, which is the man. This is the subject of the sentence. Then we have who is speaking. So this is the defining relative clause. It is the piece of information that allows us to identify the noun, or the subject, which is, again, the man. And then the sentence continues with is my teacher. So if we were to remove the relative clause who is speaking, we would have the man is my teacher, and something is missing. It is not possible to eliminate the defining relative clause because the meaning changes. Okay, so let's formally go now into non-defining relative clauses, which, on the contrary, provide additional information. They act as an add-on for the sentence, providing more information about the noun or the subject, but they are always separated by commas, and they can be eliminated from the sentence without changing its meaning. The structure is again noun plus relative pronoun plus verb. And some keywords that we can find in non-defining relative clauses are who, again, whom, whose, which. However, we will not find the word that. Okay? And let's look at an example, which would be my sister, who lives in Toronto, is coming to visit. My sister, comma, who lives in Toronto, comma, is coming to visit. So, as you can see, in this sentence, the non-defining relative clause, it is isolated between the commas and can effectively be removed from the sentence without changing the meaning. If we were to remove it from that example, we would only have my sister is coming to visit. Now, my sister, who lives in Toronto, is coming to visit, adds additional information, but it can or it can be present, and we can also remove it without changing the meaning. So those are the main types of relative clauses, but there are some variants as well that we can mention, which are relative clauses with relative pronouns and relative clauses with relative adverbs. So, a relative clause with relative pronouns use relative pronouns to connect the clause to the noun. Under this categorization, this can be either defining or non-defining and follow the same structure, noun plus relative pronoun, as we've seen. And the keywords that we can find are again who, whom, whose, which, and that. For example, we could have she's the student who won the contest. She's the student who won the contest. Okay, so as we can see, we have a relative pronoun, which is who, and it is connecting the relative clause to the noun, which is the student. Okay, so it is a relative clause with a relative pronoun, and if we were to categorize it under the first classification that we saw, this is a defining relative clause because it is similar to the first example that we saw. In this case, the relative clause is identifying the subject. So if we were to remove it, the meaning changes. Therefore, it is a defining relative clause, in this case with a relative pronoun. Now, and finally, let's look at the last variant or type, which is a relative clause with relative adverbs. So in this case, a relative clause with relative adverbs introduces the clause using a relative adverb that indicates either time, place, or reason. Okay, so the structure changes a little bit, but it's very similar. It only changes in that it's more versatile depending on the relative adverb that is used. So we would have noun and then a relative adverb that can signal place or time or reason, meaning where, when, or why, and then the rest of the sentence. So, keywords, as I said, that we can find: where, when, and why. And an example could be this house, or this is the house where I was born. This is the house where I was born. So we can see here that in this case, the relative adverb where is specifying location, place. But again, this could be a why or a when, depending on the sentence. So I hope that everything is clear and that the different types of relative and uses of relative clauses were understood. Thank you so much for looking at the video, and I will see you on the next one. Goodbye for now.